Michael had always believed he had lived a decent and honest life. He was the kind of man who took pride in his work. As an engineer, he was methodical and precise. He built his career slowly, brick by brick. Over the years, he had built a home, a cozy house with a front porch where he and his wife, Laura, would sit and watch the sun set. Their 2 sons had long since moved out, starting families of their own. Michael had always thought that their life together was one of success, stability, and love. He and Laura had met when she was 19, and he was 22, back in college. They had shared so many firsts: their first apartment, first job, first house. But after nearly 40 years of marriage, Michael realized that even the longest relationships could hold hidden fractures. He was about to find that out the hard way. It all started so innocently. One day, he decided to clean out an old closet in their home, the one that had become a storage space for things they never used. Boxes of old photo albums, old books that were never read, a few souvenirs from their travels. They had all been collecting dust for years. As he shifted through the pile, his hand brushed against something different, a small yellowed notebook tucked behind a stack of books. Curiosity got the better of him. At first, Michael wasn't even sure what it was. He had never seen Laura write anything like this. She didn't keep journals, didn't write letters. She wasn't the sentimental type. But this notebook, with its frayed edges and faded pages, was different. Michael opened it. The first page was dated over 15 years ago, and as he scanned the words, he recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Laura's. At first, the entries were just harmless musings about daily life, but then Michael began to notice something strange. There were names he didn't recognize, strange men's names that seemed to appear in several entries. Some of the words were vague, but others were damning. He couldn't help himself. He kept reading. Each sentence felt like a stone thrown into a pond, causing ripples that spread into his mind and heart. Laura had been unfaithful. The realization hit him hard. She had mentioned someone referred to only as S, someone she had been seeing while their children were growing up. Michael's heart began to race, and his hands trembled as he read further. The affair wasn't a brief mistake. No, this had gone on for years, hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. Michael could hardly breathe. He could feel his stomach twist into knots as his mind raced. How could she? How could Laura, his wife, his partner for almost 40 years, betray him in this way? The woman who had helped him build their life together, the woman who had held their children when they were born, the woman who had shared their hopes and dreams. How could she hide something so monumental from him? His world felt as if it were collapsing under the weight of the truth. But even as his emotions swirled in a storm of disbelief, anger, and hurt, Michael didn't confront her. Instead, he closed the notebook carefully and placed it back where he had found it. His mind raced as he tried to process the information. The betrayal was too overwhelming to confront just yet. He needed to think. He needed to make sense of it all before he could face her. In the weeks that followed, Michael tried to go about his life as usual, but he couldn't shake the image of those words in the notebook. Every time he looked at Laura, it was as if he was seeing her through a different lens. The woman who had been his partner for decades now felt like a stranger, someone who had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. They continued their daily routines. Laura made coffee in the mornings, smiled at him across the breakfast table, and hummed softly to herself as she moved around the house. To anyone else, they probably seemed like any other couple, happy, comfortable, secure. But Michael couldn't forget what he had read. He couldn't ignore the creeping doubt that gnawed at him every time Laura smiled at him, every time she touched him. Was it all a lie? He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way she would laugh when she spoke on the phone, her conversations with friends, always a little too animated. She was careful, always careful not to leave too much behind. Had she been hiding everything from him for years? Or had she just been a master at pretending everything was fine? Michael's mind wouldn't rest. One evening, he couldn't take it anymore. He sat down at his desk, alone, in the quiet of the house, and let his thoughts pour over him like cold water. He felt as if he were drowning in them. He went over every detail, every moment in their life together, every time she had seemed distant or distracted, every time she had laughed a little too brightly, or looked at him with a glint in her eye. Had all of it been fake? Had it all been part of some elaborate lie? Michael knew he had to know more. He couldn't live with this uncertainty. He started going through old emails, checking her phone when she left it unattended. But everything was locked away, protected. He found no clues, no signs, just more questions. Days turned into weeks, and the anger inside him only grew. He was restless. He found himself leaving the house more, staying out longer, doing anything to avoid the oppressive silence between him and Laura. He didn't know how to talk to her anymore. He didn't even know if he wanted to. Every time she asked if something was wrong, he just shrugged it off. He wasn't ready to confront her yet, not until he had answers. Then one evening, he did something he hadn't planned. He called Peter, an old friend they both knew from years ago. Michael had never been close with Peter in recent years, but they had once been inseparable. They had shared their hopes, dreams, and frustrations in their youth, but over time, their lives had drifted in different directions. Michael needed answers, and Peter, with his sociable nature, might have heard something. After some small talk, Michael steered the conversation toward their younger days. "Do you remember how Laura used to be? Back when we were all in our 20s? Michael asked, trying to sound casual. "Do you think she was distracted? Was there ever anything off about her back then?" Peter hesitated, and Michael could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. "What are you getting at, Mike?" "I don't know. I've just been thinking about things," Michael replied, forcing a laugh. "Just trying to piece some things together." There was silence on the other end of the line before Peter sighed. "Look, Mike, I don't know if I should even be telling you this, but yeah, there were rumors. Back in the day. Nothing concrete, but people whispered." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. "Who whispered? What did they say?" "I don't know," Peter said slowly. "It was just whispers at parties. Things like, 'Oh, you know Laura, she has admirers and all that. You were always working late and, well, Laura was always so beautiful. I think people noticed." Michael felt a pang in his chest. All these years, and he had never suspected. Peter had never spoken up, and now Michael felt like a fool. He had trusted Laura, trusted their life together, but now he wondered if that trust had been misplaced from the start. When the conversation ended, Michael sat alone in the dark, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had to confront Laura. He had to know the truth. But in the back of his mind, a small, dangerous part of him whispered, was he ready for the consequences of knowing everything? Days passed after Michael's discovery, but the weight of what he had learned refused to lift. Every moment he spent with Laura now felt surreal, like living in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, where every gesture, every word, was wrapped in suspicion. He couldn't stop thinking about the notebook. He couldn't stop thinking about her betrayal. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? How could he face her knowing that the woman he had spent nearly 40 years with had betrayed him so completely? But Michael wasn't ready to confront her yet. He needed answers, more than just the vague clues in that notebook. So, he did what any man with a shattered heart would do. He began to watch her closely. At first it was subtle. He would look at Laura across the breakfast table and search for something different, some small sign that would confirm his suspicions. Had she always smiled at him that way? That soft, knowing smile that used to make him feel loved and secure? Or had it always been a mask, a facade to hide something darker beneath. He started to notice things he had never paid attention to before, like the way Laura's hand would tremble ever so slightly when she passed him a cup of coffee, or how her eyes would flicker nervously when their conversation veered too close to topics she didn't want to discuss. She was always so calm, so collected. But now Michael saw the cracks beneath her calm exterior. It was a game to him now, a game where the stakes were as high as they could get. Every time Laura touched him, kissed him, or even spoke to him, Michael's mind raced with doubt. What if she was hiding something in plain sight? What if everything he thought he knew about their life was nothing but a lie? Yet she remained oblivious to the storm that raged inside him. Laura never seemed to notice how distant he had become. He didn't touch her as much as he used to. He didn't talk to her as much. There was always an invisible wall between them now, and as the days turned into weeks, that wall grew higher and higher. It wasn't just in the mornings anymore either. It was at night, too. Michael would lie awake next to her, staring at the ceiling, unable to shut out the thoughts racing through his mind. Her steady breathing beside him felt like an intrusion, a reminder that she was there but not really there. He could hear her heartbeat, steady and strong, and he couldn't help but wonder. How many times had she shared that same heartbeat with someone else? Had she whispered the same sweet things to him that she had whispered to S? Did she feel the same warmth in her chest when she was with him? Michael clenched his fists beneath the sheets, gripping them so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He couldn't stand the thought of it. He wanted to shake her, to demand the truth. But a small voice in his head told him to wait, to gather more evidence before he confronted her. For a while, he pretended everything was fine. He smiled when he had to, made small talk when necessary. He kept up appearances, all the while plotting in the back of his mind. But the tension inside him was building with every passing day, and soon enough, Michael knew he needed more than just vague entries in a notebook. He needed the full picture, the entire truth. So he began to dig deeper. Michael knew he had to be careful. Laura was a smart woman. She had always been careful with her secrets, always careful to keep her life under wraps. If she was hiding something, he would need to be meticulous. He had already searched through her belongings, her phone, her emails, even her social media. But there was nothing. Not a single message or clue that would prove the affair had ever happened. Frustration gnawed at him. He couldn't understand it. How could she have kept this secret for so long? How had she managed to hide it so well? He had spent years thinking he knew her better than anyone else in the world, and yet now it felt as though he knew nothing about her at all. One evening, after Laura had gone to bed, Michael found himself sitting in front of the computer, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He thought about searching again, going through her email, checking her messages, looking for anything he had missed. But then, something stopped him. A sudden, uncomfortable feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just the affair he was hunting for anymore. It was something more, something darker. He realized with a jolt that he wasn't just looking for the truth anymore. He was looking for a way to punish her. The anger that had simmered inside him for weeks was starting to boil over, and he wasn't sure if he could control it anymore. He wasn't sure he even wanted to. As he sat there, staring at the blank screen, Michael realized just how deep the betrayal went. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about everything, every lie, every moment of doubt that had crept into his mind over the years. Had he been a fool all along? Had she been playing him for a fool all these years? How much of their marriage had been real, and how much of it had been a carefully constructed illusion? The questions piled on top of each other, growing heavier with every passing moment. And still, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. He wasn't going to find the answers in emails or phone records. The answers, he realized, lay in the past, in the years of their marriage, in the years they had spent together, in the memories they had shared. He had to look deeper. It was during one of these long, restless nights that Michael decided to call Peter, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Peter was an old friend, one of the few people who had been close to both Michael and Laura in their younger years. If anyone could shed light on the past, it would be Peter. After a few minutes of small talk, Michael finally steered the conversation toward the past. He asked Peter about Laura, about their relationship, about whether he had ever noticed anything off between them. He tried to sound casual, but he knew Peter would be able to hear the tension in his voice. Peter's response wasn't what Michael had expected. At first, there was silence on the other end of the line, as if Peter was carefully considering what to say. And then finally, Peter spoke. "Mike, look, I'm not sure if this is something I should be telling you, but there were rumors. Back when we were younger. People talked, you know. I didn't want to believe it, but there were whispers." Michael felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He sat up straighter in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. "What rumors? What whispers?" "I don't know the details, Mike. But people always said Laura had admirers. You were always working late, and Laura, well, she was beautiful, man. She had a lot of attention." Michael's stomach twisted. All these years, and no one had ever said a word. He had been oblivious, and now it felt like the entire world had been in on the secret, but him. As the conversation ended, Michael sat in the darkness of the room, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had always trusted Laura, trusted her to be honest, faithful. And now everything was in question. Everything he had believed in, everything he had built his life around felt like it was crumbling. But what was he supposed to do now? The days following his conversation with Peter were filled with unease and restless nights. Michael spent his time alternating between pretending that nothing had changed and constantly reevaluating every moment of his life with Laura. The affair, Laura's affair, had begun to consume him. His once peaceful existence felt like a fragile shell, cracking bit by bit as each passing hour weighed him down with more and more questions. He tried to convince himself that everything could go back to normal. After all, he had kept this secret for weeks, hadn't he? He had successfully carried the burden of betrayal, even though every step he took felt like walking on broken glass. But no matter how much he wanted to push it all down, he couldn't shake the nagging thoughts in his mind. Michael had spent days pretending that his marriage was still intact, even as his heart broke with every moment spent in Laura's company. But the pain inside him was like a constant ache. He couldn't touch her the same way anymore. He couldn't look into her eyes without wondering what she was hiding. Every word she said, every smile she gave him, now seemed tainted by the knowledge that she had been deceiving him for years. Despite his anger and frustration, Michael knew he couldn't let go of the need for answers. The search for the truth wasn't just about closure anymore. It had become an obsession. He needed to know everything. How it had started, how long it had gone on, and most importantly, why she had done it. What had driven her to betray him in such a devastating way? Was there something wrong with their marriage? Or was it all just a moment of weakness on her part? The more Michael thought about it, the more he realized that he had no idea who his wife really was. He had always thought he knew her, but now it felt like she was a complete stranger. How had he missed the signs? Had she always been someone else underneath the surface, wearing a mask of love and devotion for all these years? Or had she changed somewhere along the way? He didn't know, and that was the scariest part. As the days stretched into weeks, Michael found himself obsessively searching for answers. He couldn't let go of the thought that there had to be more evidence, more information, more of the truth that Laura had hidden from him. He started paying closer attention to her every movement. He watched how she interacted with other people, especially with men. He noticed the way she laughed at their jokes, the way she made eye contact just a little too long, the way her body language softened in a way that wasn't entirely innocent. He wasn't sure if he was imagining things, but it all seemed so familiar. Had she done this with him all those years ago when they were first getting to know each other? The worst part was that he didn't know if he was jealous, suspicious, or just lost in his own paranoia. He wanted to trust her. He really did. But the more he thought about the affair, the more his own memories of their life together began to twist. What if everything had been a lie? What if she had never loved him the way she had claimed to? Each day, as he watched Laura move through their life together with her calm, easy demeanor, Michael felt himself slipping further and further into his own thoughts. He started noticing the little things, the way she would leave her phone face down on the table, the way she would look over her shoulder if she thought he was watching. She was hiding something, and it made him sick to his stomach. But still, he didn't confront her. Not yet. The fear of what it would mean to confront her was too much. What if she denied everything? What if she tried to lie to his face, pretending it never happened? He knew he couldn't stand the idea of that. He couldn't stand the thought of her continuing to deceive him. He had to have proof. One night, after Laura had gone to bed, Michael found himself in the study, staring at his laptop screen. He had already searched through her email, her phone, her social media accounts, but there was nothing. Nothing to suggest the affair had ever happened. But that wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed something solid, something irrefutable. As the evening wore on, Michael found himself sinking deeper into his search. He went back through their old photos, their vacation pictures, the letters they had exchanged over the years. He combed through their shared history, looking for any signs that might explain her betrayal. It was during one of these late-night searches that Michael stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Hidden deep within a folder of old family pictures was a series of messages, text messages between Laura and a contact simply listed as S. His heart pounded in his chest as he clicked open the folder. The messages were old, dating back several years. They weren't the kind of messages that one would expect between a married woman and a friend. The tone was flirtatious, teasing, and filled with inside jokes that Michael had never heard before. There were no pictures attached to the messages, but the words spoke volumes. The connection between Laura and S was undeniable. The flirtation, the intimacy, it was all there. It was everything Michael had feared, and just like that, the pieces began to fall into place. Michael's breath hitched as he scrolled through the messages. He couldn't stop himself. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making. The more he saw, the more his anger built inside him. How could she do this to him? How could she betray him like this and keep it hidden for so long? But there was something else, too, a gnawing emptiness in his chest. The discovery of these messages didn't give him the satisfaction he had hoped for. Instead of feeling vindicated, Michael felt like a piece of himself had been ripped away. It was one thing to suspect betrayal, but it was another thing entirely to see it, to hold it in his hands as undeniable proof of what had been happening right under his nose. Laura had been living a double life, and Michael had been the fool. He sat there for a long time staring at the screen. He felt numb. There was no sense of triumph in his discovery, just an overwhelming sense of loss. What had he lost? He had lost the woman he thought he knew. He had lost the wife he thought loved him. He had lost the future they had built together. The question started to spiral in his mind again. What should he do now? Should he confront her? Should he tell her that he knew the truth? Should he demand an explanation? Or should he walk away and never look back? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. He couldn't keep living this lie. He couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine when his whole world was crumbling around him. He had to confront Laura. He had to find out if there was any hope of saving their marriage, or if it was already too late. The silence in the house felt suffocating. Michael had spent the entire day pacing back and forth in his study, trying to gather his thoughts, trying to figure out what to do next. But there was no clear path forward, no map that could guide him through the devastation he felt. All he knew was that something had to change. He couldn't continue living like this, trapped between the knowledge of his wife's betrayal and the uncertainty of what to do with it. He could still remember the way he felt when he first stumbled upon the messages. His body had gone cold, his stomach twisted in knots. The texts between Laura and S were unmistakably intimate, filled with flirtation, longing, and something far deeper than friendship. And now, armed with this knowledge, Michael couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to confront her. He had to hear the truth from her own lips, but the thought of what would come next terrified him. He thought back to the years they had spent together, decades of marriage, of shared memories, of promises made in the quiet moments of their lives. Was it all a lie? Was everything they had built together nothing more than a facade? For a moment, he considered walking away, leaving the house and never looking back. But then his mind snapped back to reality. He loved her. Despite everything, despite the betrayal, there was a part of him that still loved Laura. He had to know if that love could survive this. The house was quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the floorboards as the wind blew through the trees outside. Michael glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight. Laura had gone to bed hours ago, and yet he hadn't been able to bring himself to face her. Every time he thought about it, a wave of nausea would rise in his chest. But now, as he stood in the hallway facing the door to their bedroom, he knew it was time. Michael pushed open the door slowly, the dim light from the hallway spilling into the room. Laura was lying on her side, her back to him. She looked peaceful, almost serene in her sleep, and for a brief moment, Michael felt the weight of what he was about to do. He could still remember the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, the woman who had been his best friend, his confidant, the one who had stood beside him through all the highs and lows of life. She had been his everything. And now, he was about to shatter that image forever. The words caught in his throat as he stepped closer to the bed. How could he say this? How could he confront her about the betrayal, about the secret affair that had torn their lives apart? Was there even a way to fix this? He stood there for a moment, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, he took a deep breath and spoke. Laura. Her body stiffened, but she didn't turn around. Michael, what's wrong? He could hear the sleepiness in her voice, the casual tone that seemed so out of place in this moment. It made his chest tighten even more. She had no idea what was coming. She had no idea that everything was about to change. He took another step closer, his voice trembling despite himself. We need to talk. Laura finally rolled over, her eyes still heavy with sleep, her expression confused. What's going on? Why are you waking me up at this hour? Her confusion only deepened the pain inside Michael. How could she not know what was happening? How could she still be in the dark after everything? I know about S, Michael said, his voice colder than he had intended. I know about the affair. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. For a moment, Laura just stared at him, her eyes wide in disbelief. Then slowly the color drained from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Michael's anger flared, but he pushed it down, forcing himself to stay calm. He had to hear it from her. He had to know the truth. Why? He whispered, the pain clear in his voice. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me enough to be honest with me? Laura's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak right away. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders as if to shield herself from the weight of the moment. I didn't mean for it to happen, Michael, she finally said, her voice shaking. It was a mistake, a stupid mistake, and I've regretted it every single day. Michael couldn't stop the wave of hurt that washed over him. A mistake? A stupid mistake? His voice cracked. You've been having an affair for years, Laura. That's not a mistake, that's a choice. She flinched at his words, but she didn't look away. I didn't want it to be this way. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for things to go as far as they did. Then why didn't you tell me? Michael pressed. Why didn't you come to me when it all started? Why didn't you talk to me when you were unhappy? Laura paused, struggling to find the right words. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could fix things on my own. But the longer I kept it a secret, the more I couldn't bear to tell you. I thought I could keep it hidden. I thought it would go away. Michael laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You thought it would go away? Laura, we've been married for almost 40 years. You didn't think I would find out eventually? She looked down, her face etched with guilt. I didn't know what to do. I was ashamed. I still am. Michael's heart ached at the sight of her tears, but his anger was too strong to ignore. You should have been honest with me, he said, his voice low and cold. You should have told me what was happening instead of hiding it from me. The silence between them was unbearable. Laura's shoulders shook with quiet sobs, but Michael couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He couldn't allow himself to forgive her so easily, not yet. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer this time. What do you want from me, Laura? What do you think we can do now? She wiped her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to fix this. I want to rebuild what we had. I don't want to lose you. Michael stared at her for a long time, his emotions swirling inside him. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he could ever forgive her for what she had done. But part of him still wanted to believe in their marriage. He still wanted to believe that they could salvage something from the wreckage. But could he? Do you love him? Michael asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Laura's eyes filled with fresh tears. No, she whispered. I love you, Michael. I've always loved you. I was just lost. The words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Michael didn't know if he could trust them. He didn't know if he could ever look at Laura the same way again. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. It would be hard. It would take time. But the pain was still too fresh to be fully swallowed. He wasn't sure how they would get through it, but he knew one thing for certain. The road ahead was going to be long.